Hi everybody. In this lecture we're going to be talking about classification of living organisms. We have talked about classification a little bit already. When we were looking at animals and we learned that there was something called a domain, and when we were talking about animals that was domain Eukarya, which includes all eukaryotic cells. And then we looked at kingdom, which we were talking about kingdom Animalia, and then we looked at the phyla that are within kingdom Animalia. All of the invertebrate phyla, Porifera, Cnidaria, etc., and of course the phylum Chordata, which contains vertebrates. So this particular lecture deals specifically with classification and why we classify things and how we do it. First and foremost, we need to understand that classification is a human construct. It's something that humans do because we like to have things organized. Living organisms have no idea what they are. I mean, they don't know that they are in this group, taxonomic group, or that taxonomic group. Humans are the ones who are doing this. We do this because we want to have things in a nice ordered fashion. It is also considered a human construct because of the fact that we are constantly changing things as we learn. Initial classification systems were based on such things as whether or not an organism would run, swim, or fly. Now, if you think about a duck, clearly this creates a problem because ducks can swim, ducks can fly, ducks can run, waddle-ish, kind of whatever. So this creates a problem. So today we classify things based primarily on their genetics. We also use the whole gambit of information that we can gather about organisms from their body chemistry, their physiology, and we put all of that together. It's called bioinformatics, and we put all of that together, and then we can piece together how things are related, which two things are more closely related. Things that have the more alike two organisms' DNA, the more related they are to each other. And so this is the way that we run classification systems today. So let's take a look at, we've taken a look at some of the characteristics of life and when we looked at animals. So you can take a look at these. All living things have metabolic processes. We have to take in nutrition, take in raw materials. We have to process those raw materials. We have to take those raw materials and turn them into raw material, turn them into us essentially, and then eliminate waste products. We grow in an organized fashion. That's a characteristic of all living things. We have to reproduce, and we respond to stimuli, whether we're talking about plants or animals or bacteria or fungi. Living things respond to stimuli. Population adaptation, which is evolution. Organisms do adapt to new environments and whatnot, as the population will, because inevitably in any population you're going to have organisms that are better, that just by natural genetic variation have characteristics that make them better suited to a particular environment. So as a result, what we end up with are those are the ones that get to survive and reproduce and put their genes in the next generation. And when that happens, the whole population ends up with these characteristics that are suited to a particular environment. We have to control and coordinate all of our metabolic activities. If you think about the fact that all of your cells have exactly the same DNA, but all of that DNA doesn't get expressed in every one of your cells, because you would end up with like a foot on your head, and that usually doesn't work. So only certain genes are going to be expressed in certain places of your body, and so that coordination of metabolic activity has to be controlled. All living things are made of cells. This is part of cell theory, and we'll talk about that in the cell lecture. All living things either are cells or they are made of cells, and that is the very first tenet of cell theory. So when we talk about classification of living things, in the animal lecture, we talked about there being a domain. Within the domain Eukarya, you have all of the different things that have eukaryotic cells. Then you have domain bacteria, which contains the true bacteria. And then you have domain archaea, which contains a group of organisms that are called archaeans. And we'll get into each of those. But domain, within each domain, we have kingdoms. Within each kingdom, we have phylums. Within each phylum, there are classes. Within each class, there are many orders. Within each order, there are families. Within each family, there are many genera, which is plural for genus. And then obviously within each genus, then we have multiple species. Each one of these can have subdivisions as well. We could have superfamilies, which would be multiple families that are more closely related to each other than they are to, say, the other families in a particular order. We could have superorders, or we could have suborders or subclasses. So all of these things could have a higher order that's in between or a lower one that's in between. I mean, there are definitely subspecies of organisms and that sort of thing. Now, you do need to know domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species in that order, from most general to least general, or from least specific to most specific. And I've put a mnemonic device here, daring kings play chess on fine grand sand. If you want to use that to help you remember, then that is completely up to you. You could create a new one if you would like to. Me personally, I don't use mnemonic devices like that. It's harder for me to remember the mnemonic device than it is to just remember what it is that I'm trying to remember. So, but anyway, you need to know domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. All right, so moving along, when we sit down with the bottom part, the genus and the species, we refer to something called binomial nomenclature. So whenever we talk about the binomial nomenclature name for something, we're talking about its genus and its species. We are Homo sapien. Common chimpanzees are Pan paniscus, or Pan troglodytes, or common chimpanzees are Pan troglodytes, and then Pan paniscus would be bonobos. Believe it or not, the genus and species name for the lowland gorilla is gorilla. So in any case, when we talk about the binomial nomenclature name for something, binomial, two names, and then nomenclature. And so naming something with two names. Whenever we write the binomial nomenclature name for something, it is either going to be underlined or italicized. The genus always starts with a capital letter, and the specific epithet always is a lowercase letter. For instance, as I have down here on the bottom of this page, Homo sapiens. So this would be humans. This literally means thinking man. So Homo sapiens. So when we talk about domains, the most general, we have three domains: domain bacteria, domain archaea, and domain eukarya. We've already talked a good bit about domain eukarya. So within, there used to not be any domains with this, and this is when I said we do change these. The more we learn, the more we have to modify the way that we put things together. Anything that wasn't eukaryotic used to be lumped together into one group or one kingdom referred to as Monera. And so that's not really correct anymore. So if you see the word Monera, you know the material that you're looking at is rather old. So Kingdom Monera was split into the Archaeans and Eubacteria, and then as we learned more, we saw that they really need to be in a domain because they are completely different than anything that's Eukarya, and they don't need to be together because Archaeans and Eubacteria are as different from each other as they are from us. And so we really do need the three domains. So now we have three domains, but there are way more than 4 kingdoms. Each one of the domains has and there could be as many as 20 kingdoms in domain Archaea. And people who study Archaea will tell you that you have all of these different. And I'm going to show you a modern, the most up-to-date tree of life here in a moment. Within domain bacteria, we have prokaryotic organisms, meaning that they have prokaryotic cells. They're very small. They don't have a nucleus. They don't have membrane-bound organelles and that sort of thing. Also, you have the same kind of cells that are in domain archaea. They're prokaryotic, so they're prokaryotic cells. Domain eukarya contains all of the eukaryotic organisms, which would be plants, animals, fungi, and then all of those things that used to be referred to as protista. Protista is no longer a kingdom. This is not a eukaryotic kingdom. We can't call that a kingdom because they don't share any type of phylogenetic background. And so there are definitely more than 4 kingdoms within eukarya. You've got, and I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to show you those kingdoms, and so we will see. And we'll get more of this when we do the cell video. But the two different major types of cells are prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Prokaryotic cells, we have bacteria and archaeans. Eukaryotic cells, we have algae, protozoans, which collectively those were referred to at one point in time as protists, but there are there are multiple kingdoms that fit that now. And then the 3 primary kingdoms of the domain eukarya, we have fungi, plants, and animals. So for all cells have cell membranes, all cells have cytoplasm, all cells have genetic material, DNA. All cells have to have energy transfer molecules, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and all have proteins, enzymes, coenzymes, etc. But prokaryotic cells do not have nucleus. They do not contain their genetic material. They do have a chromosome, but it's not the type of chromosomes that you think about when you look at a eukaryotic cell. They are typically circular DNA. It's one big circular DNA. They don't have membrane-bound organelles like endoplasmic reticulum and or any vacuoles or things like that. They also divide by fission, binary fission. And the reason that we call it binary fission with prokaryotes is because eukaryotic cells divide first by replicating its nucleus, which is mitosis. Well, since prokaryotic cells don't have a nucleus, we can't really say that they're dividing by mitosis. So here's a typical prokaryotic cell, and again, we'll see this again in the cell lecture, but you can see that they have DNA that does tend to hang out in the center-ish of the cell. We call it the nucleoid. It's not a nucleus because it's not bound by any kind of a membrane. We do have ribosomes. Ribosomes exist in a prokaryotic cell. Ribosomes are responsible for making proteins, and it's about the only organelle that a prokaryotic cell is going to have. Eukaryotic cells, on the other hand, contain, all of the other organisms, plants, animals, fungi, plus all of those things that we at one point in time threw into protista. Eukaryotic cells are larger. They have a nucleus. They have the membrane-bound nucleus. They have distinct chromosomes, membrane-bound organelles like endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, mitochondria, chloroplasts, etc. They have cytoskeleton, and they also make use of something called exocytosis and endocytosis, which are the ways of pulling things into the cell and getting rid of things. Endocytosis is when a cell pulls things into the cell. Exocytosis is when it gets rid of things. And here we have 2 common cells. We have plant cells with your chloroplast and a large central vacuole. We have an animal cell which does not have any chloroplast, and it doesn't have a central vacuole, but it has smaller vacuoles and whatnot. So the domain archaea. These are prokaryotic cells. At one point in time, we grouped them together with bacteria and called them archaebacteria, but it's inappropriate to call them archaeobacteria because they're as different from bacteria as they are from us when we start looking at the genetics and start looking at the body, at the chemistry, the metabolism of these organisms. They're referred to as extremophiles because they live in extreme environments, extremely salty, that would be your halophiles, extremes of temperature, that would be your thermophiles. Those that live in extreme acidic environments, we call those acidophiles. So these are the extremophiles of the living of all of the living domains. Archaeans can live in extreme environments, places where other things are just not going to live. Here are some examples of archaeans. The bacteria. Okay, bacteria is the other prokaryotic domain, which gives you an idea that most organisms on this planet are prokaryotic, which is true. Earth is a bacterial planet. Most living organisms are bacteria. Small, single-celled, prokaryotic. They're found everywhere. In fact, you have more bacterial cells in you and on you than you have cells that are technically human. So you're covered both inside and out with many forms of bacteria. These are your personal bacteria. It's not a bad thing. Most bacteria are heterotrophs, like animals. They have to take in nutrients. Not all of them. There are some forms of bacteria that can photosynthesize, but mostly they do have to take in organic molecules. There are some bacteria that are parasites, which means that they benefit while harming whatever their host is. A lot of them are decomposers. So when we start talking about ecology and the food web, bacteria perform an extremely important task in that they break down organic waste. Many bacteria are disease causing. For instance, pneumonia, tuberculosis, syphilis, gonorrhea, strep throat. These are all diseases that are caused by forms of bacteria. So when you get invaded by a bacterium that is not supposed to be with you, then that's a problem. Some are autotrophic, which means that they can make their own food. Things like cyanobacteria, which are blue-green bacteria, and they can actually photosynthesize. And here's some examples. Take a look at the top left hand. We have the three basic forms of bacteria, spherical cocci, rod-shaped bacillus, or spirochetes, which are spiral. So here's a typical bacterial cell. Here's some micrographs of bacteria. So this would be cocci because we've got the spherical shape, and then since it's in pairs like this would be referred to as a diplococcus. This is rod shape, so this is bacillus. All right, so protists. Notice that I've got this in quotations here because of the fact that Protista is no longer a kingdom. This is not a taxonomic term any longer. Things like an amoeba, slime moles, algae. These are all things that we used to consider protists, but now we don't. We put them in other kingdoms. Amoebas and slime moles have their own kingdoms. Most of the algae are in the plant kingdom now. So again, we don't refer to this as a taxonomic group, but these are organisms that typically are single-celled. So they're eukaryotic, mostly single-celled. Some are colonial. There are a lot of diversity here. Many species are found in the aquatic environment, and most of them as single-celled organisms gave rise to plants, animals, and fungi. Things like diatoms, euglena, amoeba. These are great organisms for you to look at under microscope in a class with students because they're great organisms to look at. So here's a current example of what's going on with eukaryotes. So we clearly have more than just four kingdoms. The ones that you're most familiar with, Plantae, Animalia, fungi, all of the rest of them that you see here are things that we used to throw together into one kingdom called Protista, but they don't share a common ancestor, and so obviously they cannot be one kingdom. So we have, kingdom that has all the slime moles, Rhodophyta, which is red algae, the Paramecia, Radiolarans, the green algae. So all of these things are like this. This is a paramecium, so this would be like an animal-like protist and then whatnot. So this gives you a good idea of how much taxonomy changes. Kingdom fungi. This might be a kingdom that you're not really that familiar with. These are primarily stationary. They're sessile. They don't go anywhere. They are heterotrophic. They must take in nutrients. They will digest food extracellularly and then suck it up. They will release digestive enzymes into their environment. It digests organic matter, and then they reabsorb the digested organic matter. They have cell walls composed of chitin. Where did we see this chitin before? Maybe arthropods. Yes, that's right. So the same polysaccharide that forms the exoskeleton of an arthropod, like insects and crustaceans, forms the cell wall of fungi. So fungi have a cell wall like a plant, except for a plant cell wall is made of cellulose. That's different from animal cells because animal cells don't have cell walls. These are very important decomposers. Very important decomposers. Some of them are even parasitic. And so mushrooms, moles, yeast, these are all fungi. Kingdom Plantae. These are mostly terrestrial, although they move a whole lot more than you think that they move. They're terrestrial, multicellular, eukaryotic, and they are not heterotrophic. They are autotrophic. They create their own food. They have a cell wall that's composed of cellulose. As I said, they are autotrophic. They contain many pigments, chlorophyll being an example. You have chlorophyll A, B, C, you have carotenoids, so you have a whole list of different pigments, and depending on which pigment you see, that's going to determine coloration of the plant. It also gives us our wonderful leaf colorations in the fall. Plants do go through photosynthesis in order to generate glucose. Now, why do they do that? They don't do it for us, they do it for themselves, because they need the glucose to go through cellular respiration, because every living organism goes through cellular respiration, not just animals and things that are heterotrophic. Plants go through cellular respiration too. That's why they photosynthesize, in order to make the glucose that they need for going through cellular respiration. So they also take in oxygen and they release CO2 during cellular respiration. Plants reproduce both sexually and asexually, which we've talked about what that means already. Plants are classified as being either vascular or non-vascular, which depends on whether or not they have vascular tissue. Non-vascular plants tend to be very small. Things like mosses, because they don't have a vascular tissue to move water or food throughout their bodies. Vascular plants are the ones that tend to be big, and you could have all sorts of vascular plants, some that make seeds and some that don't make seeds, those that have a flower, those that don't have a flower. None of the vascular plants make seeds, non-vascular plants. So non-vascular plants do not make seeds, non-vascular plants do not have flowers. They all reproduce with what are called spores. The vascular plants, however, some of them reproduce with spores, some of them reproduce with seeds. So if we take a look at our classification of vascular plants, we have those things that make flowers, which we refer to as angiosperms. And we have those things that don't make flowers, which are called gymnosperms. Angiosperms, if something has a fruit, it's an angiosperm, because the only way to get a fruit is if you have a flower. Gymnosperms are cone-bearing plants. Literally, it means naked seed. So their seeds are inside a cone, so there's no flower. Both of these two types of plants, angiosperms and gymnosperms, reproduce with seeds. So if plants are reproducing sexually, they have sperm and egg unite, and we've talked about that kind of reproduction before. It's the same thing with animals. With plants, we refer to that as being pollination, although plants also reproduce sexually even if there's not pollen involved. Ferns reproduce sexually, And other plants that don't make seeds and only make spores also reproduce sexually with the joining of sperm and egg. Plants can reproduce asexually by the fact that typically if you cut off a part of a plant, it will continue to grow. Their cells are pretty undifferentiated, and so they can grow that way. All right, I'm going to stop right here with this particular lecture, and then we'll pick up with classification part 2.